Yeah, thanks for joining for my talk. This is maybe not the most advanced OT talk you will see or hear about, but it's also meant for people who maybe not know so much about OT. And actually, an ex-colleague of mine just walked in and said, "Well, I don't know that much about OT, so this is the talk for you." A little bit about my background. I recently joined as a CTI specialist at the NCC. Before that, I did penetration testing, ethical hacking for about 20 years, different companies. And during that time, I also got the chance to actually test some OT systems myself. So I'm actually combining both threat intelligence and my hands-on experience here in this talk, and hopefully will give you some insight. Because why do I want to do this presentation? Well, I know what OT systems look from the inside. I know what vulnerabilities are there, but I also see the outside world where there's a lot of focus on the latest 0 days or the latest APTs hacking into these systems. And I think there's a big disconnect between these two. And because there's so much focus on the high-end attacks, I think a lot of people just give up and say, well, I'm not going to fix it. It's not worth doing it. I'm just going to do nothing. And because there's nothing that can be done, everything can be hacked. We all heard it before. And I hope I can change that a bit, because I think there's still a lot that can be done, a lot can be improved to actually make those systems a little bit more secure. I'm not sure who has previous experience with OT. Raise hands. Yeah, about half of it. Okay. So some of it may sound familiar to you already. But why is it different? Because it is different in some way, but it's not different in some other ways. What is different is that it's a lot of legacy, because these systems typically run for 30 years or 30 years plus. So you get a lot of old systems that were designed in a different time. They were also designed with safety in mind, and that means physical safety. And not with security in mind. So there are fail-safes, but they're aimed at some incident happening and not somebody deliberately changing your process or meddling with your process. And availability is most important in these systems. Things have to run. There's not so much confidentiality. Integrity comes second, but it is actually reversed from an IT environment. And incidents may have physical impact. So if things can go wrong, in some systems you have the safety instrumentation systems that actually will kick in, but still things can actually explode. So in some cases, so that makes it interesting as well. But first, a look at threat actors. And I see this part, people typically skip in OT environments, and they think about attackers physically coming onto your premise or into your factory, plugging in a USB device and hacking your systems that way. But there's actually a lot of different ways that can be done, and easier ways as well. And I actually start with ransomware first. And not many people realize that ransomware is actually a big problem in these environments as well, because it is untargeted. So that also means that everybody can become a victim, also OT environments. And they're not specifically targeting the OT process itself, but they're actually focusing on the IT systems, because that's what they know and understand. They just run their playbook and run their scripts as they normally would. However, there's a lot of connections still between IT and OT. If you first start talking to people who run OT systems, they say, oh, it's not connected. And when you start asking questions, you say, oh, but how do you actually get your antivirus updates if you are running antivirus at all? How do you actually manage your system? And then increasingly, you see more and more connections. So it's a myth that there's still air-gapped, although they were designed that way. It's not the case anymore. And actually, there's an increasing number of incidents. And I made the following slide. This is from Dragos, which is an American company who tracks threat actors, both nation states, but also ransomware nowadays. And these are just the incidents from Q2 this year. So you see, it's quite a lot. And you see the different ransomware groups, and each dot is one victim. So you can also see who's most popular. And it's actually increasing compared to Q1 as well. And that also has to do with the the actions, the legal actions that were taken before, like some of the takedowns that were done by law enforcement. But it's actually increasing again, and they also see new groups actually they have never seen before. And of course, those are still on the right side there. They're not doing that many attacks yet, but there's actually an increase. And they also see government-affiliated groups now adopting ransomware attacks. They actually reuse the existing samples that are available, modify it a bit, and actually also sort of hide their tracks that way to make it seem like it's ransomware, but it may be not. Or that they're just trying to disrupt processes. And again, they're not targeting OT systems directly, but they're targeting maybe your Active Directory, which is mostly shared between IT and OT. Or it's not shared, but there is a trust between them. Typically a two-way trust. So basically, if effectively for a ransomware actor who is domain admin in your IT environment, he can do whatever also to your OT systems. And then we're talking, of course, about the Windows systems more in the higher layers of your OT network. But that happens to be the HMIs that actually are a human-machine interface. That's what your operators look at. It's the SCADA systems that actually measure a lot of things on a bit higher level, like what's the production, etc. I don't know many operators who would happily run the environment if these systems are not available. I mean, the process itself might still run, but you don't have visibility anymore. And typically that still means you actually go into controlled shutdown. Or it could be as benign as your ERP system, which is actually within your IT environment is not available anymore. So you cannot produce or you cannot ship anymore. Your label printers are not working. Actually, the scales in your factory to weight what you've produced are out of order. So you still have to shut down. And actually, these numbers are quite high. And if you want to look at the full analysis, there's actually the link. I will, of course, also provide slides later, then you can have a look. But it's actually, yeah, most people overlook this actor in relation to OT networks. And then there is this group, the Hacktivism group. And that's a difficult group to look at because it's really a mix from local environment groups till more organized groups. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in the next slide. And in essence, it's still untargeted. They're more device-oriented. They know how to hack into a certain device. And they're not targeting you specifically, but you just happen to have the device to know how to exploit. And like I said, there are diverse groups, but in the recent years, we see more and more that there are actually also connections and ties between these and APTs. They're sort of doing the dirty work, and I'll show you a bit more about that. And mostly they're targeting internet-connected OT devices. And that may sound strange. How do these devices end up on the internet? But there are actually quite a few. And technically, those hacks have actually a low complexity. It's not hard to do. It's sometimes even defacing banners on systems or clicking around in an HMI interface. They still have consequences, and there has been physical impact. But yeah, it's quite a problem actually. This group, because if you look at the census query I've done yesterday evening, these are all the systems, and I'll just look at the numbers all the way on the left. You could actually see the number of systems that are identified by census as being ICS or SCADA related. They have a couple of labels, and they're all over the world. But actually, the Netherlands is well, what is it? I haven't counted exactly, but you can see it over there. Over 1,500 systems connected to the internet. Why are these systems there? Who put them on these networks? And I looked a little bit into it. You actually see a lot of systems that are connected to the mobile, so the IP ranges of mobile internet providers, so the KPNs, the Vodafone, Zigos, etc. And And why is that? Well, you have suppliers who may think it's a good idea to actually use a 4G router to connect these devices to the internet because they need to manage it. So there's still a lot of these devices around. And there's also different groups looking at these. So you have CAR, or a Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. That is actually nowadays linked to Sandworm. So it's linked to an APT. And they look at the internet and what they can find. And the still of this HMI is actually from a video they put online, where they are actually clicking on all buttons they can find and changing values. I really got the idea they have no clue what they're doing, and still they manage to overflow the water tank you see over there. And it's also hard to actually verify if these claims are true or not, or if they're just fabricating information. But in this case, it was eventually confirmed that indeed they managed to overflow the water tank. And if I look at what they're doing in that video, I've really look at, like, do you actually understand at all what you're doing, or is it just sheer luck you actually managed to overflow the water tank? But still, they are causing issues. Another group is Cyber Avengers, linked to Iran, that actually are targeting Unitronics PLCs for the very reason that those are Israeli PLCs. So if you happen to have these devices connected to the internet, hopefully not, they will deface them. So it's completely unrelated to your OT environment or your business. And then we have another group, which is quite hard to, Sonspec or something like that, that's actually targeting Ukrainian telcos with wiperware. And that's what you also see. It's also where there's geopolitical tension. You see that there's actually these groups that pop up and may actually attack you. Espionage, more targeted, mostly targeted at critical infrastructure, because they want to have information about these environments. It's mostly about two things: gathering information about your OT environment, which is typically saved within your IT environment. So they use either vulnerabilities or spear phishing to get a foothold, steal all the information they want, try to maintain that foothold, also the pre-positioning, to come back at a later time. One example of these is actually Fault Typhoon, who was in news before as well, but they have done a second attack where they actually target US critical infrastructure. So far, they have not reached the OT environment, but you see them targeting critical infrastructure. They actually use an unknown Fortinet exploit. In the past, they've also exploited 0 days, so they do have 0 days. But once they are inside the network, so they start at the edge device, which is typically not very well monitored. But once they are within the network, you see the typical red teaming activity, living off the land. Quite detectable, I would say. But they try to maintain access for a long time, and I think it's because they want to pre-position and come back at a later time. And that's actually what you see in the next group. So sabotage, that's extremely targeted. And basically you see it mostly being done by the espionage groups, or they might have a subgroup. So they first steal the information. They're going to work on some piece of malware, maybe specifically to that environment, and they come back at a later time. They already have the access to the IT environment. They still need to find their way into the OT environment. And from my own experience testing these environments, I know that's not that difficult. So once they're already pre-positioned, they might come back. And the reason we don't see these kind of events that much is also it has political consequences, because these are state-sponsored actors and you're targeting other countries. So what they mostly do till now is that they actually run those Hacktivism groups as a sort of front to do at least, try to poke the bear a bit to see how people respond. And they don't do the full attack yet, although there have been some cases. And I actually put them in a timeline, and I'm really glad this screen is quite big, because I struggled quite a bit to make this timeline, because some of the malware is a bit smaller, but I hope it's still readable. But till now, there are only 9 pieces of malware that are known to specifically target ICS systems and protocols. And that's over a time span of 14 years. So just to give you an idea that, yes, if you get targeted by these malware samples and you have an actor using it in your network, the consequences can be high. But what is the chance, actually? And if you're not critical infrastructure, maybe this is not your worst, your biggest concern. Compared to the numbers of 1/4 of the cybercrime and the ransomware, you actually see there's a huge difference. And still, I see a lot of focus on this one. I actually, quite recently, was at an event, and I won't give any more details what it was exactly, but there somebody said, yeah, nation states, we can do nothing about it. And first question, of course, is a nation state really your biggest concern? And second is, well, can you do something about it? I think there's still things you can do. Because if we look at the common vulnerabilities and weaknesses we see within these environments, it's not that shocking, actually. But first, a bit about security testing. So right now, I'm working on as a CTI specialist, but I used to test these networks for a living. Not full-time, but I spent quite some time developing actually a way to securely test these systems, because one thing you might know if you run an OT environment, typically you don't want somebody as a pen tester running around without any idea what he's testing, because he will actually take down your systems. Because they're less resistant to security testing. Why? Well, they haven't been exposed to security testing that much. Sometimes they run on limited resources, specifically the more low-level devices like the PLCs. You can easily overflow them just by running AMAP with the wrong parameters. It's that easy. And you could still say, well, availability is most important, so that's an interesting contradiction. But yeah, you don't want to do that in production. Also, there are almost no test environments. There's no spare parts, there's no redundancy. There's sometimes some redundancy within the process. But for instance, if a PLC breaks and they need to replace it, they need to go to their supplier. They don't have one in stock. They don't have a test environment. So how do you actually test your updates for your PLCs? Or maybe you just don't update them. Maybe that's easier in these cases. And that's why an OT security assessment, as I designed it, is actually a combination of an architectural and configuration review combined with some light security testing, because it's too dangerous to do it in production. And if you want to have an idea, this is actually from ControlThings.io. They provide this PDF, which has a great overview what scans are somewhat safe to run and what scans are highly dangerous to run in these environments. I would recommend to have a look at these this presentation, because you will be surprised that even a simple fingerprint from AMAP might already crash your device. So you really have to know what you're doing. And during the assessments, what we've done is that we actually used also the same monitoring appliances they use for monitoring these networks. So one thing we would do is actually connect our own system to the network, actually have a trunk port into the network, so you could actually hop between the VLANs, scan within local VLANs, not through firewalls, and yeah, be very careful what you do. And then you find a lot of things. There's actually a lot of things wrong. It already starts with when you start requesting your information to actually do this properly, because you do this in a white box fashion. You want as much information as possible. But you already notice that when you start asking about network drawings and assets overviews, that they're not there. Either you get a network and don't have a network drawing, or you have a network drawing that's outdated. I've had network drawings that were literally the place where was the 19-inch rack and where the servers were, or where the physical network connections were, but no logical layer 2, layer 3 network design. Or it was really fragmented and the vendor only or supplier only drawn their own part of the network. But there was no overview. And that's really shocking to me, because these environments are pretty static. They don't change that much. Of course, there is some upgrades. There are vendors coming in and out. But compared to an IT environment, it's really static. And still, they don't have an asset overview. So how can you secure if you don't know what you have? And then, of course, there's the firewall and network switch configurations. As you may know, there is a firewall between IT and OT. Sometimes two even, back-to-back, different vendors, things like that. But does it really matter if you have one or two, if they're really badly configured? Because that is what I've seen in practice. I went through all those firewall rules, and there's a lot of any's. There's a lot of like testing rules and fixed to be fixed later, and nobody dares to touch them anymore because they don't have a clue on the protocol level how these networks work. So yeah, in a network where you want to have high availability, or availability is most important, you don't touch it as long as it works. And then you accumulate over the years a very large rule base. But after about 50 rules, you can basically say, okay, this is sort of like an any rule. So it's not that useful anymore. Another thing is remote access. Because you have a large dependency on suppliers coming in or doing remote maintenance, and you actually are really dependent on them, because typically the asset owner don't know anymore how to run these networks themselves. So if the vendor demands they want to have remote access, they get remote access. And how do they get remote access? Well, quite literally VPNing somewhere in the network, literally directly into your OT network. Or they nowadays have these boxes that make reverse connection to a sort of cloud. So then you don't have to configure a firewall anymore. You can actually connect that way. But you still see that these networks are managed by suppliers that connect on the network level. So basically, if they run a wrong command or they are infected with malware, it might actually spread into your OT network. So that's quite dangerous as well. I haven't discussed the network switches that much. I forgot those. What you typically see with the network switches is that they are shared between IT and OT. So they do use different VLANs. But I had situations where actually the management interface with a very weak password was exposed to the IT side. So I once actually phoned a customer and said, okay, now connect to this IP address, log in with this password, and you're actually on the switch. And I said, well, no, you can also see your OT networks. You might be able to reconfigure it if you have the experience and the knowledge. And of course, this is a little bit more advanced attack. But we also see some actors actually hacking into firewalls and VPN devices. I'm sure they might be able to configure a Cisco switch. And the same thing is true for virtualization. Also, virtualization solutions, they're used quite heavily now in OT environments as well for the Windows systems or the higher layer systems. But again, it's shared between IT and OT. And one step further, it's also integrated with their Active Directory. So now you have an actor, even ransomware actor, that is domain admin in your IT environment. Guess what? He also controls your complete OT environment, because if he does a simple shutdown, well, good luck. So there are these things that you see over and over again. And then we talk a little bit more about the network design. And who is familiar with the Purdue model here? Ooh, not that many people. Okay. The Purdue model is a model that is more like a layered model, how you can actually organize your IT and OT networks. So it starts at the top, level 5, which is actually your internet DMZ, as you would have in your IT environment. Then the enterprise zone, level 4, is your internal network, your IT environment. And then you have a firewall between IT and OT, which I mentioned previously. There's not one version of the Purdue model. That's a bit unfortunate, because there are versions with or without level 3.5, which is the DMZ. Sometimes it's called level 3, and then there's still DMZ. But yeah, there are some different versions. But actually, as you have a DMZ between the internet and your internal network, you would also have a DMZ between your internal network and the OT network. What I see mostly is that firewall is there, but there is no DMZ. So through that firewall, we allow direct connections between IT and OT, sometimes both ways. And over here, it's a little bit less easy to see, but here between level 3 and 2, you also see firewalls. And you have these zones, which are actually could be different factories. So those are also separated. What I typically see is that there might be a firewall between IT and OT, but the rest of the network is almost flat, or there's some VLANs, but there's never a firewall in between anymore. So between level 3 and 2, I don't see that being used at all. And I've also had a situation where I looked at network designs and looked at what it looked in practice. And I also found loopholes around firewalls, like extra connections they forgot to remove and all sorts of things. So people really don't seem to understand how to use this model in the correct way and how to architect your network using this design. And why is this so important? Well, as you may know, some of the OT protocols that are being used are by design insecure. They don't use encryption, they use either no authentication or weak authentication. So having a layered network design is actually a very important defense mechanism. And if you don't have that, well, there's not that much that can protect you in some cases. And also, if you want to do this right, basically, you want to have no direct connections between IT and OT or the internet. And you might think internet. I have actually seen situations where maintenance was allowed directly in from the vendor all the way straight to your devices, sometimes even into the lower levels like level 2 or even level 1. So yeah, that's not the way to do it. You actually have a DMZ. You should also have intermediate systems in there. And typically you will also want to pull the data from the systems in your planned DMZ. So the systems in your OT environment should actually connect towards level 3.5 and get the information, and not vice versa. So you don't want to have incoming connections from level 3.5 downwards towards your process. Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention is this is basically as close to the process you can get. So this is actually your sensors, your actuators, your field devices that actually control and measure your process. Level 3 is where you find the Windows systems, the Windows-based systems. So there your Active Directory could live, your engineering workstation, which is also very important because that is the system where you have the software installed to actually program your PLCs. So where will attackers go if they are really targeting your environment? They will go to your engineering workstation, or they might hit your domain controller, which is also there, depending on if it's a separate domain or not. And then, of course, like I mentioned, we have these Windows systems, and we have the Active Directory being shared or trusted, but we also have the systems itself. And there are a lot of vulnerabilities because these systems are either not patched or not regularly patched. And that's a difficult thing because, yeah, sometimes processes run 24/7. So there are not that many windows to patch. However, I've seen systems that have not been patched for 10 years. And I'm quite sure that in the most processes there is somewhere a maintenance window. And also because some of the software running on these systems is very dependent on the configuration of the system. You cannot patch these systems yourself because the supplier will demand how the system should be configured. And most of the times it's not very secure. And I think this is also an area where a lot of cooperation is needed with your suppliers to also stimulate them a bit to come up with more secure configurations. Actually build like a golden image which is securely configured, because we do use virtualization a lot. So that actually means you can build secure templates in cooperation with your supplier and use those. And also the hardening of the systems. Typically, if you look at these systems, every piece of software that they might need for support and everything else is installed. And it ranges from old Flash versions to the full Office suite, all sorts of software which they may not need. So removing all that extra software actually limits your attack surface a lot. And then if we look at the lower level devices, it's even easier. If you want to hack those, the first thing you do is look up the manual of these devices. In there, you will find the default password. 9 out of 10, these work. And not always do you see those network or those management interfaces exposed to the rest of the network. I mean, it might be the local network segment you only can access these. But I've seen also situations due to misconfiguration, you could actually access these from the IT environment. And once you log in, it's as simple as doing a shutdown or reset the configuration or just reconfigure the IP address. Remember, availability gone. And then we, of course, have also vulnerabilities in these devices. And patching is, like I mentioned, is always difficult. But again, once you know about these vulnerabilities, if you don't have the layered network design in place, you don't have another option to patch, I think. Because you don't have any protections. Because if, for instance, there is a vulnerability in a specific ICS protocol, which is only exposed in the local network segment and not accessible from remote, you could say, okay, I have this protection in place, I can patch at a later time. But if you don't have that network design and everything is open, you will have to patch, or not, and hope for the best. And then there's this interesting thing about the management protocols. So typically PLCs or whatever devices, they might have management software. And this is something you typically do in a test environment. So sometimes you have a specific device you can test within a test environment. What I 9 out of 10 do first is get the management software. Why? Because they have all these mechanisms to actually log in without authentication. And you will find the weirdest serial protocols stacked on top of UDP packets on a random high port you never heard about. And you can actually access these devices without any vulnerabilities. And remember that if we do talk a bit about APTs, that there are quite some resources on that end as well. What do you think what they will do? Of course they will read the manual. They will look at existing vulnerabilities and they will also look at those management protocols. And this is also if we see as well. So I go back a bit because I forgot to mention something on this slide. If we look at some of the more recent malware, you actually see they abuse the legitimate ICS protocols to actually just control systems. So for instance, if we start with the latest one, Frosty Goop, that was actually just a piece of software that had a Modbus library implemented that could talk to a certain PLC. And just by knowing what registries and values to read or write, you could actually shut down these systems. And were actually management system for buildings. So building management systems in Ukraine, and they actually shut those down. So, my conclusions, there's still a lot of room for improving security of OT environments, at least in my experience. And I have to say that depends a bit on what industry you're in, because some industries like oil and gas and maybe the electricity companies may have a higher security standard, but still I've seen a lot of things go wrong. And actually threat intel may help you to focus your efforts and actually determine what your risk is. And it's not hard, but it does require effort. Yeah, I think I mentioned most things already. So a couple of quick wins. Also start with an asset inventory. Work together with your vendor and improve your network architecture. And now, if you still worry about nation states, and I put in some memes there. The guy over there is Rob Joyce. He used to be the director of tailored access operations from the NSA. He actually did a brilliant presentation already in 2016 where he explains how nation states attack and what they actually do. And they say, well, they adapt to the target. They won't use 0 days if they don't need to. And they will invest the time and money to really know your systems. And actually, the security measures I just mentioned, if you take these, like network segmentation, you make their life hard as well. And if you don't believe me, watch this presentation. That's it.